I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are driving down a major modern highway today.
Right, like your standard everyday commute.
Exactly. You know the drill. You're listening to music, maybe sipping some coffee.
Just trying to get to work.
Yeah. But instead of seeing massive billboards for, personal injury lawyers or fast food rest stops, every single meter of that road is lined with a gruesome, prolonged execution. Just a
Wow.
continuous, unbroken corridor of human suffering stretching on for like over 100 miles.
It really is a staggering image to try and process. We're talking about 200 kilometers of the Italian countryside, completely and intentionally transformed into a nightmare.
Right. 6,000 crosses, each one bearing a man who had followed the gladiator Spartacus in his massive rebellion against the Roman Republic.
A truly scale-defying event.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are looking at a really fascinating stack of sources to figure out how this happened. We've got historical overviews, physiological breakdowns from modern medical analyses, and firsthand accounts from first-century historians.
And our mission today isn't just to gawk at the sheer brutality of Roman crucifixion, right?
No, not at all. We want to look past that surface-level horror to understand the cold, calculated architecture of terror that Rome used to maintain its empire.
Which is such an important distinction to make.
It is. And just to set the stage for you listening, these sources deal with some incredibly brutal realities of empire and slavery. Our goal today isn't to editorialize on the morality of the ancient world.
Right, we are just here to impartially unpack what the historical records in these articles tell us about how this massive system operated.
Because this wasn't just, a sudden chaotic act of revenge by a victorious general, was it?
Far from it. When the Roman general Crassus finally crushed the Spartacus rebellion, the crucifixion of these 6,000 men wasn't the end of the war for the
It
Romans.
was more like a beginning.
Exactly. It was a very deliberate beginning of what came next. The Roman state understood that to be effective, state-sanctioned terror had to be permanent.
And highly visible.
Yes, it had to be attached to the very infrastructure that people used every single day.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really grasp how engineered this whole spectacle was, we have to look at the process from the very beginning.
Or we really do.
We have this iconic image in our heads of those 6,000 crosses standing along the Appian Way. But based on the sources, the destruction of these victims began long before they ever reached that wood.
Yeah, it was a multi-stage process.
Right.
The Roman legal system actually required a very specific stage of physical punishment before a crucifixion could even take place.
And they called it the verberatio. Right.
That's right. It translates roughly to a mandatory flogging, but using the word flogging or whipping really doesn't capture what this actually was.
Yeah, I saw in the sources that they used a specific instrument for this called a flagellum. I'm guessing that's not just like a standard leather whip.
Not at all. The flagellum was an instrument entirely designed to destroy tissue.
Oh.
We are talking about multiple leather thongs, and braided into the ends of those thongs were heavy pieces of lead, metal, or sometimes bone.
Lan, that is just horrific.
It is. The historical articles emphasize this point strongly. It wasn't designed to sting or bruise the physical form beneath it. It was designed to break the body open.
So they were actively trying to inflict as much trauma as possible right out of the gate.
Yes. The condemned were stripped, bound to a low stone post, and usually 2 soldiers would alternate their impacts.
And what really blew my mind reading through this is the chilling lack of parameters around that beating. There was no fixed limit to the number of lashes, right?
Correct. No mandated count of 39 lashes or anything like that.
And no doctor standing by to say, hey, he's had enough, his punishment is complete.
What's fascinating here is how deliberate every single variable was. They specifically targeted the back, the legs, the places on the body that would cause the most sustained, catastrophic damage without causing outright immediate death.
Because the only actual constraint on the soldiers swinging the flagellum was that the victim absolutely had to survive the beating.
Exactly. They had to survive it.
And this is where the history gets incredibly dark. The sources mention they actually assigned a Roman soldier specifically to monitor the prisoner's condition during the flogging.
Yes, they did.
At first, you might think, oh, someone is making sure they don't go too far. But it wasn't out of mercy at all.
No, absolutely not. Mercy didn't factor into it.
It's almost like a twisted, macabre assembly line.
Yeah.
Having that soldier there was a horrific form of quality control.
That is such a good way to put it.
The product, meaning the victim, had to survive long enough to be put on display. If they died during the verberatio, The Romans couldn't use them for the actual billboard on the highway.
That is the perfect way to look at it. If a prisoner lost consciousness, they were revived. We actually have the writings of the first-century Jewish historian, Josephus.
Right, he witnessed executions firsthand.
He did. He witnessed Roman executions later on during the siege of Jerusalem, and his description is just haunting. He wrote that men were reduced by the flagellum to something he described with grim precision as being physically shattered before they even reached the cross.
Physically shattered.
Yeah.
And he wasn't just being poetic.
No, he was being medically literal.
So you have a victim who has experienced severe blood loss, massive tissue damage, and they are, as Josephus said, physically shattered. But they aren't just carried to the cross, are they?
No. Once the verberatio ended, the condemned was handed the patibulum.
That's the horizontal cross team, right?
Exactly.
How heavy are we talking?
Modern historians estimate it weighed anywhere between 30 and 50 kilograms.
Jeez.
So roughly 65 to 110 pounds.
And they had to carry it themselves.
Usually tied or nailed to their arms, yeah. Paraded through the streets as part of the procession to the execution site.
Which brings up a massive question. So they've engineered this extreme blood loss, this unimaginable muscle fatigue from the beating and carrying a 100-pound beam.
Right.
But why? If the goal is a permanent public billboard on the highway, a dead body decays too fast. They needed these men alive on those crosses for as long as possible.
Precisely. They wanted them lingering.
So how did the cross itself actually kill them if they were already on the brink of death?
That is exactly where the dynamic of the punishment completely shifts. They arrive at the site. They are hoisted up onto the stipes.
The stipes being the upright beam.
Yes, the upright beam permanently fixed in the ground. And at that point, the cause of suffering changes. It is no longer primarily about blood loss.
Right.
The actual cause of death in crucifixion is asphyxiation. It becomes entirely about the mechanics of breathing.
Okay, this is the part of the medical analysis source that I found profoundly disturbing to read.
It's very grim.
When a victim's arms are elevated and their entire body weight is suspended on that upright beam, their chest cavity is physically locked in a state of forced inhalation.
Exactly.
Their lungs are pulled completely open by gravity and the weight of their own body.
Most people assume you just hang there and eventually bleed out or starve. But no!
It's way worse.
To exhale, to simply push the breath out of their lungs, the crucified person had to physically push upward with their legs.
Or pull up with their arms?
Right, to momentarily shift their weight and relieve the pressure on their chest.
Wait, securing the feet sounds like it gives them support, almost like a mercy? Like, so they aren't just dead weight hanging by their wrists.
It seems like that at first glance, but biologically, it's actually the ultimate trap.
Because giving them a platform forces them to do an agonizing push-up just to breathe. I couldn't believe it when I realized that.
It's brutal.
Every single breath out requires this massive, agonizing muscular effort. You have to push your entire body weight against a nailed or bound foot, scraping that shattered, beaten back against the rough wood just to push the carbon dioxide out.
Yes.
And the second you relax from exhaustion, you slump back down and the chest locks open again.
That is the horrific genius of the engineering. Nailing the feet gave them a surface to push against, which meant they could continue this agonizing cycle of exhaling for hours, sometimes even days.
Which is exactly what the Romans wanted.
Exactly. If they didn't have that support, if they couldn't push up, asphyxiation would arrive in a matter of minutes. The Romans fully understood this physiology.
They really had it down to a science.
They did. We look at the first-century Roman medical writer, Celsus. He documented the physiology of various torments in incredible detail.
So it wasn't a mystery to them.
No, Roman officials and physicians knew exactly what the cross did to the human body, and more importantly, they knew exactly what variables controlled the duration of the dying process.
Right, because we see evidence of them speeding up the timer when it suited them. The sources mention a practice called the Crucifixion,
Yes, the breaking of the legs.
just shattering the bones.
We have records of Roman soldiers using heavy mallets to shatter the femurs or tibius of the crucified. We see this famously referenced in the executions at Golgotha.
And that was a purely practical tool, right?
Very practical. If Roman officials needed the bodies down quickly because of an impending religious festival or a simple schedule change, they broke the legs.
Because if you break the legs, the victim can no longer push up to exhale.
Exactly. Suffocation follows in minutes.
But for the 6,000 followers of Spartacus on the Appian Way, General Crassus gave absolutely no such order.
Not a chance. He wanted them up there for as long as humanly possible. And if we want to understand the reality of this, we have to factor in the environment.
Right, the Italian climate.
This was the Italian summer of 71 BCE. The heat would have been sweltering.
Oh, man.
You have open injuries from the flagellum exposed to that heat, to the swarms of insects, to the inevitable slow progression of infection.
Which just compounds the misery.
Severe dehydration would rapidly accelerate the cramping and deterioration of their muscles, making that horrific labor of breathing harder and harder with every passing hour.
And what's wild is that the sources say there was no standard blueprint for how a person was affixed to the cross.
Right, there wasn't just one way to do it.
Another first-century writer, Seneca, observed that there was no fixed ritual form. Sometimes they used nails through the wrists, sometimes ropes, feet together, feet separate. Sometimes victims were even hung upside down.
And that variation was deeply intentional.
How so?
By making the geometry of the execution completely chaotic and entirely subject to the whim of the presiding Roman official, Rome systematically stripped the victims of any dignity.
Ah, I see.
It prevented the execution from acquiring the uniform look of a recognized martyrdom. It was designed to look like an ungovernable, chaotic destruction of a human being.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you have to step back from the medical horror and ask the big administrative question.
Which is,
Why? Why go through all this immense logistical trouble to design a machine that makes dying take days? Who is this 200-kilometer display actually for?
that is the crucial question. You have to look at the geography of where Crassus placed them.
Right.
He didn't put these 6,000 crosses out in the middle of a remote, barren desert where no one would see them. He commissioned them specifically for the Via Appia.
Which was the main superhighway connecting Rome to Capua,
Yeah.
the most heavily trafficked road in the Republic.
Exactly.
If you're listening in your car right now, look at the distance you cover in an hour on the interstate. Now imagine crosses lining that entire stretch, just a few feet from your window.
It's almost unimaginable.
Every senator, every wealthy merchant, every military envoy moving south passed through that corridor. And incredibly, the sources tell us that trade never stopped.
No, it didn't.
Commerce just moved right past the dying men.
But those wealthy merchants and senators weren't the primary audience for this display.
Who was it meant for then?
The primary audience was the people traveling with those merchants and senators.
Oh, the enslaved people.
Yes, the massive population of enslaved people attached to those trade caravans, and the tens of thousands of enslaved laborers working the massive agricultural estates that lined the road.
That makes total sense.
In fact, Roman legal theorists had a highly specific name for crucifixion. They explicitly called it the servile supplicum, a slave's punishment.
Because the demographics of the time were basically a ticking time bomb.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the sheer numbers in Italy at the time of Spartacus's rebellion. Historians estimate that 30 to 40% of Italy's entire population was enslaved.
30 to 40%. Let's put a modern heuristic on that.
It's massive.
Imagine walking through your office building or your local grocery store and knowing that 4 out of every 10 people you see are legally classified as property.
Yeah.
And if you're part of the ruling class, you are acutely, terrifyingly aware that you are vastly outnumbered by people who have every reason to want you dead.
Precisely. The entire Roman economy, the massive agricultural fields, the urban infrastructure, the domestic households, it all depended absolutely on this forced labor.
It was the foundation of everything they had.
And that kind of system, that extreme ratio of citizen to enslaved person, is constantly teetering on the verge of collapse or violent rebellion. Spartacus proved exactly what happens when that powder keg ignites.
So the cross wasn't just a punishment for a past crime, it was a societal pressure valve.
Exactly.
It was a tool of economic preservation. You have these enslaved laborers commuting past this 200-kilometer display of horror every single day as they work the fields.
Exactly. Rome used the cross as a social boundary drawn in human flesh. It wasn't meant to intimidate the armies of rival nations.
It was domestic.
Yes, it was meant to show their own domestic enslaved population that the consequences of resistance would be so catastrophic, so prolonged, and so incredibly public that rebellion simply wasn't even worth conceptualizing.
It was the permanent, highly visible architecture of terror strictly required to keep that brutal economy running smoothly.
Exactly.
But the punishment didn't actually end when the victim finally stopped breathing, because the Romans weren't just attacking the physical body.
No, they were going much further.
They were attacking the soul, and they were attacking history itself.
The final phase of this punishment, which is often overlooked, is the strict denial of burial. And to understand how devastating that was to the people of the ancient world, we have to look at Roman law.
The 12 tables.
Specifically, the 12 tables, yes.
I noticed that in the historical sources, the 12 tables were Rome's earliest codified laws, right? And they were incredibly precise about funerary rites.
Very precise.
Normally, even disgraced citizens or enemy combatants killed in battle usually got some kind of minimal burial rites.
Because burial carried profound legal and cultural weight in the ancient Mediterranean, the 3rd century Roman jurist Appian noted in his legal commentaries that the body of a crucified man could technically be given to relatives who formally requested it.
But there was a catch.
Yes, but only at the absolute discretion of the presiding governor, and for enslaved people who had participated in a massive state rebellion. That discretion was essentially never, ever exercised.
So the bodies were just left on the cross, and not out of bureaucratic neglect, but by strict state instruction.
Deliberate exposure.
The Appian Way ran through miles of open rural countryside. Pliny the Elder, the Roman author and naturalist, actually noted the natural association between crucifixion sites and carrion birds.
Right. Vultures, ravens, feral dogs.
Pliny recorded it almost like a simple, mundane fact of nature, without any particular horror. The scavengers weren't an accident. They were expected. They were part of the display.
And in the broader Mediterranean religious culture of the time, this was the ultimate catastrophe. Burial wasn't just about public health.
It was a spiritual requirement.
It was the mechanism by which the dead passed from the world of the living to the afterlife. Without the proper rites, the prevailing belief was that the soul was left trapped in this terrible wandering state of incompleteness.
If you are listening, I want you to just imagine the psychological toll on the families of those 6,000 men.
It's heartbreaking.
Your father, your brother, your son is up there. You have to walk past him on your daily labor. You have to watch the elements take him. You have to watch the birds arrive.
And you can't do anything.
And you are legally, strictly forbidden under threat of death from taking him down and giving him peace.
It was a weaponized form of grief with absolutely no resolution. It extended the punishment outward, radiating from the man on the wood to everyone who had ever known him, everyone who shared his household, and everyone who shared his chains.
So what does this all mean? The ultimate punishment here wasn't death. Death happens to everyone.
Right.
The ultimate punishment was complete historical erasure.
Yeah.
These men hung there for weeks, maybe months, and eventually what was left was simply cleared away like garbage by the Roman road crews responsible for keeping the highway functioning.
There was no funerary inscription,
Yeah.
no mass grave, no stone carved with a single name.
Just gone.
The ancient historian Appian preserves the round number for us, 6,000, but that is literally all we have.
Wow.
There is a complete deafening silence in the historical record, where 6,000 individual human histories, 6,000 lifetimes of memories and families should be.
They weren't meant to be remembered as men. They were meant to be seen purely as a consequence.
And you can really feel the heavy weight of that erasure when you contrast it with the Via Appia today. Parts of its original paving stones still survive in the beautiful archaeological park just outside Rome.
Tourists walk on it every day.
Yeah, and flanking that exact same road are the ruins of grand, elaborate funerary monuments built by wealthy Roman families. Families who had the money and the power to guarantee their memory in stone for thousands of years.
And those grand monuments line the exact same road where 6,000 men vanished from history without a trace. That extension of grief, that complete removal of a person from the face of the earth, was the entire point.
It was the goal all along.
Rome never needed to say it out loud, because they understood the mechanics of power perfectly. The most complete form of erasure isn't just killing someone in the dark. It's killing them in public, prolonging their suffering for days, displaying what is left, and then actively removing even the memory of their existence.
This raises an important question about how we view those very same marvels of the ancient world today.
Exactly. It really forces you to reconsider everything we think we know about history. Understanding the past isn't just about memorizing the dates of the Third Servile War or knowing who Crassus was.
No, it's so much deeper.
It's about seeing the cold machinery underneath the empire. We always hear about how the Romans built these incredible aqueducts and these vast, enduring networks of roads. We praise their engineering.
But they also engineered psychological control.
Exactly. The mechanics of asphyxiation, the flagellum, the denial of burial, none of it was just cruelty for the sake of being cruel. It was a highly calibrated system to keep a brutal economy functioning.
The infrastructure of their civilization was built right alongside the infrastructure of their terror. You couldn't have one without the other.
I want to leave you with a thought to chew on, building on everything we've just unpacked from these sources. Think about those physical ancient stones of the Via Appia that tourists happily walk on today, taking photos, admiring the glory of the ancient world.
It's quite a contrast.
What does it actually mean for our understanding of great civilizations when we realize that the most enduring monuments of Roman infrastructure, their mighty connecting roads, were simultaneously their most deliberate, calculated instruments of mass terror?
Yeah.
When you really look at the architecture of the Appian Way, do the roads of empires always require ghosts to pave them?
It's definitely something to think about the next time you find yourself commuting on a long highway.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.